Ars Notoria, Episode 2. Global Cognitive Warfare and Control Systems. Chapter 1. The War You Were Born Into. You were not born into a neutral world. You were born into a battlefield. Not one of tanks and explosions, not one of borders drawn in blood and soil, but one of attention, memory, and perception. A war where the most valuable territory is not land, but the space inside your skull. And the most powerful weapon is not a missile, but a thought you believe is your own. You took your first breath into a system already in motion. Long before you learned to speak, to read, to question, your nervous system was already being trained. By sound, by repetition, by emotion, by reward, by fear. This is the war you were born into. And like all the most effective wars, it is invisible to those inside it. The end of physical war, the beginning of mental war. For most of human history, power was seized through force. Armies marched, cities burned, kings rose, empires fell. Control was external. You ruled bodies. Then something changed. In the 20th century, the greatest tacticians, psychologists, and intelligence agencies reached a terrifying realization. If you control how people think, you no longer need to control where they stand. Why occupy land when you can occupy belief? Why silence mouths when you can pre-program thought? Why rule with fear alone when you can rule with identity? This was the birth of cognitive warfare. Not the destruction of nations, but the redesign of minds. What cognitive warfare actually is. Cognitive warfare is not propaganda in the old sense. It is not just lies on posters. It is not just fake news. It is not just political spin. It is the systematic shaping of perception so that you see what you are meant to see, want what you are meant to want, fear what stabilizes the system, and reject anything that threatens it, all while believing you acted freely. True cognitive warfare is silent. It does not announce itself. You never feel attacked. You feel normal. The three primary weapons. Across every modern control system, regardless of ideology, nation, or culture, the same three weapons appear over and over: fear, repetition, identity. Fear breaks resistance. Repetition carves memory. Identity locks obedience in place. You can remove any one of them and control weakens. But when all three align, a human being becomes predictable, and predictability is the foundation of power. Fear, the oldest switch in the nervous system. Fear is older than language, older than government, older than religion. It lives in the spine, not the brain, and it bypasses logic completely. When fear activates, the prefrontal cortex shuts down. The amygdala takes over. Long-term thinking collapses. Obedience skyrockets. A frightened mind does not ask, "Is this true?" It asks, "How do I survive?" This is why every control system eventually leans on fear. Fear of poverty, fear of exclusion, fear of being wrong, fear of being alone, fear of being destroyed. A calm population is impossible to rule for long. A frightened population governs itself. Repetition, the sculptor of reality. Your brain does not define truth by logic. It defines truth by familiarity. The sentence you hear once is an idea. The sentence you hear 1,000 times becomes reality. This is why advertising repeats, news cycles repeat, social media loops repeat, trauma replays repeat. Repetition does something terrifyingly simple. It convinces the brain that what is frequent must be important, and what is important becomes memory, and what becomes memory becomes identity, not because it is true, but because it is familiar. Identity, the final lock. Fear opens the nervous system. Repetition writes the program. But identity is the lock that keeps it running. Once a belief becomes who you are, Logic no longer touches it. If an idea threatens your identity, your nervous system reacts as if it is physical danger. This is why people defend ideas that destroy them. Nations fight over stories. Families tear themselves apart over labels. Entire generations suffer for narratives they never chose. Identity transforms control into self-defense. You no longer obey, you protect. The difference between a citizen and a target. Here is the line nobody tells you exists. Some people are treated as citizens. Others are treated as targets. A citizen is educated to think. A target is trained to react. A citizen is given context. A target is given conclusions. A citizen is shaped by complexity. A target is shaped by slogans. The modern world is quietly drifting from one category to the other. Why you never learned this in school? Because cognitive warfare is the meta weapon. If people recognized it as a weapon, it would stop working. You never studied it as a battlefield. You studied fragments, psychology, media, advertising, sociology, political science, but never as a unified weapon system. Because no empire educates its population in the mechanics of its own control. The uncomfortable truth. Here is the truth that destabilizes almost everyone who first sees it. You are not as independent as you feel. Your preferences were shaped. Your fears were trained. Your distractions were injected. Your ambitions were redirected. Not necessarily by a single villain, but by systems that evolved around your nervous system faster than your nervous system evolved to defend itself. The battlefield is now visible. From this moment on, you are no longer innocent. You now know there is a war. Not one that will appear on maps. Not one that ends with treaties. Not one you can escape by relocating. A war that follows you into your bedroom, into your phone, into your memories, into your dreams. And now a single question hangs in the air. If your mind is the battlefield, who do you think has been winning so far? Chapter 2. Education as the first programming chamber. You were not educated. You were formatted. The classroom was not designed as a sanctuary for intelligence. It was engineered as the first mass conditioning chamber ever built. Not to make you powerful, but to make you manageable. The bell that still rings in your nervous system. Think back. The bell rings. You stand. The bell rings. You sit. The bell rings. You move. For over a decade of your life, your nervous system learned one rule with perfect precision. Your time does not belong to you. The bell was not a convenience device. It was Pavlovian conditioning. Over time, your body learned to respond to external command faster than conscious thought. Even now, when your phone buzzes, when an email arrives, when a notification flashes, your spine reacts before your logic does. This is not coincidence. It is obedience training embedded into muscle memory. The grade is a dopamine collar. At first they gave you stickers, then numbers, then letters, then rankings, then futures. Your nervous system became addicted to external validation before you ever understood what it was. Not because you were weak, because your brain evolved to chase reward, and school weaponized that instinct. The grade did not measure intelligence. It measured compliance with the system's format. Sit still. Speak only when permitted. Repeat what is approved. Forget what is inconvenient. Those who obeyed were called smart. Those who questioned were called difficult. This is how dopamine networks were hijacked at scale. You learned to chase approval, not truth. Memorization without meaning equals learned helplessness. Here is one of the most sophisticated psychological tricks ever deployed on humanity. You were forced to memorize information you did not emotionally connect with, for outcomes you did not choose, for futures you did not architect. What does the nervous system learn from this? Effort does not create agency. It only produces survival. This is the birthplace of learned helplessness, a condition where the brain learns, nothing I do truly belongs to me. And a helpless mind is the safest mind to govern. Why natural geniuses were problematic. The system never loved innovators. It tolerated them only when they could be exploited. The child who finishes tasks instantly, asks uncomfortable questions, rejects instructions, connects patterns too fast, is not rewarded. They are disciplined, labeled, isolated, or medicated. Because a mind that cannot be paced cannot be mass managed. The education system prefers adjustable minds, predictable minds, slower minds that wait for permission, not fast minds that generate reality. Uniform curriculum equals uniform consciousness. Every classroom runs on synchronization. Same book, same pace, same test, same answer. This is not standardization. This is consciousness alignment. When millions of minds absorb the same timeline, the same narratives, the same heroes, the same villains, reality becomes collectively editable. And once reality can be collectively edited, power becomes narrative, not force. Why critical thinking is always coming later. They promise you critical thinking. Later, after the exams, after the degree, after the certification, after the validation. But thinking is dangerous before identity ossifies. A child that truly thinks independently becomes difficult to frame, difficult to brand, difficult to predict, and impossible to normalize. So education postpones real thinking until the identity has already been assembled. By the time you are allowed to think freely, you no longer know how. Obedience feels like safety. Here is the most brutal truth. The system does not rule through cruelty most of the time. It rules through comfort, predictable schedule, predictable future, predictable career ladder, predictable role. Obedience feels like safety, and safety feels like morality. This is why so many defend systems that quietly dismantle their potential. They confuse familiarity with goodness. Why the classroom prepares you for surveillance. You sat under watch for years, eyes tracking, attendance taken, behavior graded, performance measured. Long before digital surveillance, your nervous system learned how to exist under observation. That is why modern tracking systems feel invasive, but not inconceivable. The training came first. The technology came later. The education system is not broken. This is what destroys most people when they finally see it. The system is not failing. It is succeeding exactly at what it was designed to do. Not to create liberators, but to create workers, consumers, voters, and emotional stabilizers of the structure. The outliers who escape, they are statistical noise, not the goal. The first cage you loved. Your first cage did not have bars. It had desks. It had homework. It had praise. It had futures attached to numbers. And because it was wrapped in duty, order, approval, and the promise of success, you loved it. Which is why breaking free later feels immoral. But now the question sharpens. If your mind was shaped before you ever chose who you wanted to be, how much of yourself was really chosen by you? Chapter 3. Media as a memory editing machine. You do not remember the world as it is. You remember the world as it was shown to you repeatedly, with emotion attached. This is not a philosophical statement. This is how the human brain actually stores reality. And once you understand that, you understand why media is the most powerful weapon ever built. Memory is not a recording, it is a rewrite. Most people believe memory works like a camera. It doesn't. Every time you remember something, the memory is retrieved, opened, modified, restored. This process is called reconsolidation, which means your memories are not stable, they are editable. Media edits memory without you noticing. Not by lying once, but by repeating a frame until your brain accepts it as how things are. Emotion is the editorial tool. The brain does not prioritize truth. It prioritizes emotional charge. That is why calm facts are forgotten, shocking visuals stick, fear locks memories, rage strengthens recall, humiliation never fades. Media doesn't need to convince you with logic. It only needs to make you feel something strongly and repeatedly. Emotion turns information into permanent identity material. The news is not about information. It is about state control. The modern news cycle operates on one dominant frequency: threat, war, disease, collapse, crisis, outrage, scandal, enemies. Not because the world is only darkness, but because a nervous system under threat refreshes more often, watches longer, thinks less critically, shares more impulsively, and obeys authority more easily. A frightened population is a high-engagement population, and high engagement is profitable. Trauma loops. Why you can't look away. A trauma loop works like this: shock, fear, compulsion to check, relief, repeat. Over time, this creates addiction to instability. You stop asking, "Is this important?" You start asking, "Did something bad happen yet?" This is how doom scrolling forms, news addiction forms, anxiety becomes identity. You are not addicted to information. You are addicted to survival anticipation. Narrative is the real battlefield. Every era has many events, but only a few become the story. Media does not show reality. It selects which reality you are allowed to emotionally live inside. Who is the villain? Who is the victim? Who is dangerous? Who is heroic? Who deserves empathy? Who deserves erasure? Once the story is emotionally locked, facts become irrelevant. Why repetition beats truth. The human brain uses a shortcut called the illusory truth effect. The more often you hear something, the more true it feels, even when you know it may be false. Repetition carves familiarity. Familiarity creates trust. Trust becomes belief. Truth is fragile. Repetition is unstoppable. Media programs your emotional reflexes. Notice this. Before you consciously judge a story, you already feel something about it. Anger, disgust, fear, pride, shame. Those emotions are not spontaneous. They are trained reflexes. Media doesn't change what you think first. It changes how your body reacts instantly. And once the body reacts, the mind justifies. Why you feel like everyone is crazy now. Your nervous system evolved for tribes of 150, slow information, direct consequence. Now it absorbs millions of emotional signals per day, conflicting narratives, artificial urgency, performative outrage, algorithm-amplified extremity. Your brain is not broken. It is overstimulated beyond its evolutionary design. The confusion you feel is not weakness. It is data saturation trauma. Media does not control everyone the same way. Here is the invisible filter. Media does not need to control everyone. It only needs to control the most reactive, the most fearful, the most emotionally hungry. Because those people become the loudest voices, the strongest amplifiers, the social pressure. The calm minority is drowned by the emotional majority. This is psychological crowd engineering. You are not informed, you are conditioned. If information made people free, the most informed generation in history would be the most independent. Instead, we are the most anxious, the most polarized, the most distracted, the most emotionally programmable. Not because we lack intelligence, but because our memory is under continuous emotional rewrite. So the question sharpens again. If what you remember is being shaped by what shocks you most, how much of your worldview did you actually choose? Chapter 4. Algorithmic Possession. For most of human history, desire was considered uncontaminated, a quiet emergence, an internal movement, a direction sensed rather than instructed. That assumption no longer survives intact. In the present era, desire is no longer merely discovered. It is formed in advance, shaped by systems that observe without interruption. When observation became intimate, the earliest digital systems recorded, later systems organized. The current systems infer. They do not wait for meaning, they extract correlation. Every delay in movement, every late interaction, every repeated return, every moment of hesitation is translated into behavioral probability. Over time, the models grow closer to the nervous system than conscious awareness itself. What once required self-knowledge now emerges as statistical forecast. Recommendation as a silent architecture. A recommendation appears trivial, a suggestion, an option, a path among many. Yet visibility is never evenly distributed. What is shown first gains weight. What remains unseen quietly disappears from consideration. In this way, recommendation becomes architecture, not a command, a corridor. Movement feels voluntary. Direction is prearranged. The quiet mutation of choice. The classical image of choice assumes initiation from within. In predictive environments, the sequence inverts. The stimulus arrives first. Recognition follows second. Justification forms last. The sensation of choosing survives. The origin of the choice becomes obscured. Agency does not vanish. It becomes conditionally staged. Dopamine and the machinery of anticipation. Dopamine is not satisfaction. It is the signal that something might arrive. Digital systems learn to operate directly on this uncertainty, by spacing reward, by delaying resolution, by varying outcome. What once belonged to instinct becomes an engineered cycle. The nervous system remains in expectation without arrival. The resulting economy no longer trades only in goods, it trades in unfinished wanting. The erasure of endings. Previous media forms contained natural closures. Digital environments remove them. Without endings, rest does not arrive. Meaning does not consolidate. Memory fragments instead of forming. The cognitive state becomes continuous intake. Motion without arrival. Presence without resolution. Preference as a trained response. Taste is no longer shaped only by experience. It is shaped by sequence. Repeated exposure softens resistance. Softened resistance invites further exposure. Over time, preference reorganizes along paths of least friction. What feels intimate often reflects the mathematics of repetition. Identity as a predictive surface. Identity once accumulated through memory and conflict. Now it is supplemented by predictive abstraction. The individual appears simultaneously as person profile probability. The inner narrative persists. Alongside it, an external model evolves silently. Guidance without resistance. Force produces opposition. Arrangement produces alignment. When environments are built so that certain movements feel easier than others, behavior clusters without struggle. No pressure is required, only design. The source of modern fatigue. Personal regulation now operates inside infrastructures designed by behavioral science, real-time adaptive systems, machine learning, economic extraction models. The imbalance of scale does not produce failure. It produces exhaustion, not moral collapse, structural fatigue. Control through comfort. Earlier systems ruled through restriction. Modern systems rule through convenience. Personalization replaces orders. Automation replaces enforcement. Ease replaces compulsion. Control arrives without weight, without declaration, without visible edge. The remaining illusion. The central illusion is not privacy, it is authorship. The belief that interaction alone guarantees sovereignty. Yet sovereignty requires delay, friction, reflection. When influence consistently precedes recognition, authorship becomes uncertain. The feeling of direction remains. The source of it becomes indistinct. Nothing announced the transition. No warning was issued. No decision was requested. The shift occurred through refinement, through ratios, through feedback, through optimization. And what remains is no longer a moral question. It is a structural one. When prediction precedes intention, what becomes of the self that believes it chooses? Chapter 5. Trauma as a control lever. For most of human history, trauma was understood as a wound, a rupture in memory, a fracture in continuity, an event that bent the nervous system away from equilibrium. In the modern era, trauma has acquired a second function. It has become a control surface, the nervous system under threat. The human nervous system evolved to protect against immediate danger. When threat appears, perception narrows, time distorts, memory sharpens, and reasoning yields to survival response. This reaction once saved lives. In environments of continuous symbolic threat, it no longer resolves. It remains active. A nervous system that cannot exit survival mode becomes hypervigilant, easily startled, intensely reactive, and longing for relief. This state is not rare. It is increasingly common. Trauma without closure. Earlier forms of danger arrived with physical boundaries. War ended, disasters passed, threat retreated. Digital environments remove those boundaries. Images recur, narratives refresh. Shock never fully finishes. Without closure, memory does not settle. Meaning does not consolidate. Fear remains ambient. Trauma becomes atmospheric rather than episodic. It no longer belongs to a single moment. It becomes a condition. Hypervigilance as a predictable state. A hypervigilant nervous system scans continuously for danger, for changes in tone, for signs of rejection, for instability. This state resembles awareness, but it is not awareness. It is anticipatory fear. And anticipatory fear produces one critical outcome: predictability. What is predictable becomes governable. From wound to leverage. Unresolved trauma does not remain passive. It seeks stimulation, validation, distraction, containment. Cycles form: shock, anxiety, distraction, temporary relief, renewed shock. Over time, the nervous system learns relief comes from external regulation. This is the moment trauma becomes a lever. Behavior stabilizes around the search for relief rather than the pursuit of meaning. Fear as behavioral infrastructure. Fear is no longer only an emotion. It becomes an organizing principle. Economic behavior aligns with it. Social behavior adapts to it. Political behavior depends upon it. Decisions increasingly orient around safety, avoidance, protection, and risk minimization. Not around creation, not around curiosity, not around expansion. The compression of time. Trauma collapses temporal depth. The future shrinks. The past intrudes. The present narrows. Long-term thinking weakens. Short-term regulation dominates. This compression favors impulsive response, reactive identity, emotional automation. Sustained complexity becomes difficult to hold. Trauma and identity fusion. When a wound is not metabolized, it integrates into identity. The person no longer experiences trauma. The person becomes organized around it. Language shifts. Behavior reorganizes. Boundaries harden. The wound ceases to be an event. It becomes a lens. Why traumatized systems resist resolution? Resolution ends leverage. A regulated nervous system tolerates uncertainty, delays reaction, resists emotional hijack, and generates autonomous direction. Such systems are difficult to steer through fear-based messaging, which is why traumatic atmospheres rarely prioritize resolution. Containment is more functional. Collective trauma as a control climate. When fear becomes distributed across entire populations, it forms a control climate. Not through command, but through shared nervous system tension. Collective hypervigilance stabilizes. Mass compliance, rapid narrative shifts, and emotional synchronization. In such climates, reaction outpaces reflection. The illusion of protection. Structures built around fear often present themselves as protective, security, stability, safety, order. Yet protection that reinforces permanent threat does not resolve danger. It institutionalizes it. The cost of permanent survival mode. Nervous systems were not designed to remain in survival indefinitely. Chronic activation leads to emotional exhaustion, cognitive narrowing, dependency on regulation from outside, and gradual dissociation from self-directed meaning. The organism survives, the interior world contracts. Trauma does not dominate through brutality alone. It governs through repetition, through unresolved memory, through ambient threat, through the quiet conversion of fear into routine. The question is not whether trauma exists. It is structural. When fear becomes continuous, does it still signal danger, or does it quietly become the environment? Chapter 6. Identity Engineering. Identity was once shaped slowly, through family, through geography, through memory, through language, through conflict and continuity across time. It carried friction. It required negotiation. It resisted immediate revision. In the present era, identity has entered a new phase. It has become engineerable, from inherited identity to constructed identity. For most of history, identity arrived through birth. One entered a name, a culture, a lineage, a social position. Change was possible but rare. Digital systems altered this structure. Identity became editable, distributable, replicable, and reversible. The question shifted from, "Who am I?" to, "Which version of me is currently visible?" The acceleration of self-definition. Earlier identities unfolded across decades. Now they update within weeks. Profile images change. Language shifts. Values realign. Affiliations appear and vanish. Stability dissolves into versioning. The self becomes a sequence of releases rather than a continuous narrative. Identity as a response to visibility. Identity increasingly develops in relation to being seen, not through solitude, but through exposure. The individual no longer asks, "What feels true?" The question quietly becomes, "What receives confirmation?" Visibility becomes the mirror, and the mirror changes daily. Segmentation and the end of the unified self. Predictive systems do not treat identity as singular. They divide it into clusters: consumer identity, ideological identity, aesthetic identity, emotional identity, aspirational identity. Each segment is conditioned separately. The unified self fragments into behavioral compartments. Contradiction becomes operationally acceptable. The comfort of belonging. Fragmentation produces uncertainty. Uncertainty generates anxiety. Anxiety seeks resolution through belonging. Groups offer shared language, shared threat, shared meaning, shared enemy. Belonging reorganizes the self around the collective. Individual ambiguity collapses into group certainty. Identity as a defensive structure. When identity hardens, it becomes protective. Beliefs are no longer ideas, they become armor. Contradiction is reinterpreted as attack. Dialogue shifts into defense. Opposition is no longer informational, it becomes existential. Narrative as identity cement. Identity requires story. Narrative supplies it. Every identity depends upon an origin story, a set of grievances, a vision of threat, and a promise of restoration. The structure is remarkably consistent. Only the symbols change. The utility of polarized selves. Polarized identities generate stability through tension. Each side requires the other to remain coherent. Without opposition, the structure weakens. Conflict sustains meaning. Meaning sustains attention. Attention sustains control. Identity as a predictable output. Once identity is stabilized around narrative and threat, it becomes statistically tractable. Behavior aligns with expected reactions, repeatable language patterns, reliable emotional triggers. Response becomes forecast. The self becomes a pattern. Why identity is the final lock. Algorithms guide movement. Trauma sustains volatility, but identity secures long-term alignment. Once a behavior is fused to identity, it no longer feels imposed. It feels chosen. Control no longer requires constant reinforcement. It is self-maintained. The illusion of absolute difference. Every engineered identity asserts its uniqueness, yet structural analysis reveals repeating forms. The surface varies, the architecture repeats. Difference becomes a styling layer. The operational logic remains constant. Identity was once a question carried inward. Now it is a structure anchored outward, not discovered in silence, but assembled through exposure, segmentation, and reinforcement. The question that remains is not personal, it is systemic. When identity becomes modular, does the self remain a center or simply a configuration? Chapter 7. Fear as the operating system of society. For centuries, fear functioned as a signal. It alerted the organism. It prepared the body. It mobilized the mind toward survival. Fear was specific. Fear was finite. Fear was event-bound. In the contemporary world, fear has undergone a structural transformation. It has shifted from response to infrastructure. When fear became ambient. In earlier eras, fear rose and fell with danger. Modern systems generate a different pattern. Fear no longer spikes. It circulates, not as panic, as atmosphere. An ever-present tension, subtle, directionless, unresolved. Ambient fear rarely overwhelms. It simply never departs. The economics of uncertainty. Uncertainty now functions as economic fuel. Markets move on speculation. Media thrives on escalation. Social groups cohere around shared anxiety. In this structure, fear is not an error. It is a resource. Systems reliant on rapid engagement and constant attention benefit from environments where individuals remain alert, reactive scanning for threat. Fear becomes a predictable stimulant. Fear as a social synchronizer. Fear spreads efficiently. It travels faster than hope, faster than logic, faster than reflection. Shared fear synchronizes behavior. It aligns groups around common threats, simplified narratives, binary divisions. Fear collapses complexity into clarity. Clarity encourages cohesion. Cohesion becomes influence. The compression of cognitive space. Fear narrows perception. It reduces available options. It accelerates decision-making. It favors immediate action over long-term planning. In this compressed cognitive space, nuance fades, deliberation weakens, extremes appear attractive. The organism seeks certainty, even when certainty is manufactured. The architecture of threat. Modern environments contain a continuous stream of symbolic threats, not physical danger, cognitive danger. Threat arrives in forms such as alarming headlines, predictive warnings, social comparison, political volatility, environmental collapse, imagery. Each may be rational. Collectively, they create an architecture of instability. No single threat dominates. The structure itself does. Emotional automation. Fear creates predictable internal shifts. Heart rate, attention, focus, memory encoding, impulse regulation. These reactions are ancient. Modern systems interact with them in real time. Fear becomes automated, triggered, amplified, rewarded, repeated, not intentionally, structurally. Polarization as a byproduct of fear. Fear prefers boundaries. It divides the world into safe versus unsafe, friend versus enemy, truth versus threat. This binary orientation organizes populations into opposing camps. Each side becomes more internally synchronized and externally antagonistic. Polarization is not simply conflict. It is the stabilization of identity through opposition. Fear as a substitute for meaning. In times of uncertainty, fear becomes a placeholder. It offers direction, urgency, purpose. Fear explains what is wrong and indicates where attention must go. In the absence of meaning, fear provides structure. But the structure is reactive, not generative. The incentive to maintain fear. Systems built on attention do not require catastrophic fear. They require sustained tension. A low-level signal strong enough to keep individuals scanning, prevent mental rest, sustain engagement. Fear becomes a strategic equilibrium. Too weak, and attention drifts. Too strong, and systems destabilize. The optimal range is somewhere between. The displacement of agency. Under continuous fear, agency shifts subtly. Decisions become less about aspiration and more about avoidance. Action becomes protective rather than creative. Life becomes organized around preventing loss, minimizing risk, avoiding catastrophe. The horizon of possibility contracts. Fear as an operating system. An operating system runs silently beneath applications. Fear performs similarly. It shapes evaluation, reaction, narrative, memory, identity, behavior. Without commanding, without announcing itself. Fear becomes the background process that structures experience. Fear no longer arrives as a crisis. It circulates as climate. Its function has expanded beyond survival to the synchronization of populations and the stabilization of systems. The question is not why fear persists. It is structural. When fear becomes the default environment, does society still respond to danger, or does it begin to operate through it? Chapter 8. Reality Reduction and the Narrowing of Perception. Human perception was never infinite. It developed under constraint. Early environments required selective attention, to track movement, to interpret signals, to evaluate danger, to allocate cognitive energy. Perception expanded where survival demanded it, and contracted where it did not. Modern environments do something different. They compress reality by design. The narrowing is not biological. It is structural. The flood that shrinks awareness. Information abundance was expected to expand understanding. Instead, abundance creates saturation. When signals overwhelm capacity, attention fragments, interpretation weakens, detail loses relevance, depth collapses into surface. The mind responds by conserving energy. It reduces what it perceives, not out of failure, out of necessity. The efficiency of simplification. Complexity requires effort. Effort requires time. Modern systems reward speed over depth. Simplified frames spread faster than nuanced ones. Digestible narratives outperform intricate explanations. Short-term reactions eclipse long-term comprehension. The environment selects for reduction. Perception adapts accordingly. The substitute of representation for reality. As experiences become mediated, representation replaces presence. Images replace landscapes. Headlines replace events. Profiles replace persons. Metrics replace meaning. The substitute is not identical to the real, yet it becomes the dominant input. The organism begins interacting not with the world itself, but with symbols of the world. The loss of the peripheral. Peripheral awareness once supported survival. It sensed context, nuance, subtlety, shifts in tone, quiet, emergence. In overstimulated environments, the periphery contracts. The gaze narrows. The field of relevance shrinks. Only the brightest signals remain visible. A reduced world results. Hierarchies of attention. Modern systems create attention hierarchies. Signal amplifiers determine what rises, what repeats, what disappears. Reality becomes stratified by visibility, not by significance, by amplification. What receives no visibility gradually leaves the perceptual map. Latency and the collapse of depth. Depth requires latency, a pause, a moment of consideration, a gap between stimulus and interpretation. Environments of continuous input erase latency. Reaction replaces reflection. Interpretation becomes instantaneous. Depth collapses into immediacy. Shallow cognition becomes adaptive. The fragmentation of coherence. Perception depends on continuity. Stories bind experience into meaning. Fragmented input disrupts this coherence. Pieces replace wholes. Moments replace narratives. Signals replace contexts. The world becomes a sequence of disconnected fragments rather than an integrated field. The rise of the hypersalient. Hypersalient signals dominate reduced perception. They rely on contrast, emotion, novelty, sensory intensity. Hypersalience is not accuracy, it is visibility. The perceptual system reorganizes around what stands out, not around what matters. The reduction of the self. As the outer world narrows, the inner world compresses with it. Identity formed from fragmented impressions, mediated interactions, simplified narratives, accelerated feedback. The self adapts to its environment. When perception shrinks, identity shrinks. Not in value, in dimensionality. The comfort of a smaller reality. A narrower reality can feel stable, less noise, less uncertainty, fewer variables to consider. But the stability is illusory. It is constructed through omission. The world becomes easier to manage because most of it is no longer being seen. The invisible cost. Reduction preserves energy. It protects the nervous system. It supports rapid functioning. But it comes with a cost. What is unseen cannot be understood. What is not understood cannot be engaged. What cannot be engaged cannot be changed. A narrowed reality limits possibility. Perception was shaped by evolution. It is now shaped by architecture, by signal density, by amplification structures, by simplification incentives, by mediated representation. The question is not whether reality is shrinking, it is structural. When the perceptual field contracts around what is most visible, what becomes of everything that no longer enters the frame? Chapter 9. The erosion of memory. Memory once served as the foundation of continuity. It preserved identity. It linked past to present. It allowed meaning to persist across time. To remember was to maintain a coherent self. In the modern environment, memory functions differently. It has become fragile, unstable, and increasingly externalized. The erosion is not accidental. It is structural. Memory's biological constraint. Human memory was never perfect. It evolved to be selective, to store patterns, not details, to prioritize danger, not completeness, to keep what was meaningful, not everything encountered. This selectivity once supported survival. Now it interacts with information density in unpredictable ways. Saturation and forgetting. Continuous input overwhelms memory formation. When the nervous system receives more signals than it can consolidate, encoding weakens, retention shortens, recall fragments, relevance becomes unstable. Forgetting becomes the default outcome. Memory collapses, not from disuse, but from excess. Externalizing memory. Modern environments offer substitutes for internal memory. Archives, devices, notifications, digital histories, cloud storage. Information remains accessible without being remembered. The organism adapts. Why encode what can be retrieved externally? Memory shifts from internal continuity to external availability. The cost is subtle. Retrieval replaces integration. The loss of narrative memory. Narrative is how memory becomes meaning. Events cohere. Experiences connect. Time acquires direction. Fragmented input disrupts narrative formation. What is remembered becomes brief, isolated, contextless, emotionally heightened, but structurally shallow. Continuity dissolves. The self becomes a sequence of impressions instead of a flowing story. Editable memory. Digital memory differs from biological memory in one crucial respect. It is revisable. Images can be replaced. Records can be curated. Histories can be reordered. Unpleasant fragments can be removed. Memory shifts from permanence to presentation. The past becomes a managed artifact. The acceleration of forgetting. The speed of modern input shortens the lifespan of memory. Attention moves forward before memory finishes forming. Encoding fails. Consolidation weakens. Recollection becomes effortful. The organism compensates by relying on prompts, feeds, reminders, resurfaced content, algorithmic rediscovery. Memory becomes passive. It waits to be triggered. The emotional hijacking of memory. Emotion accelerates memory, but modern systems amplify emotion selectively. The resulting memories become disproportionate, intensified, distorted. Memory no longer reflects environment proportionally. It reflects what was made salient, not what was most significant. The collapse of long-term memory. Long-term memory requires quiet repetition, latency, reflection. Modern environments offer noise, novelty, interruption, speed. Long-term memory weakens. Short-term impressions dominate. The temporal depth of the self contracts. Memory as a target of influence. What people remember determines what they believe, how they decide, whom they trust, what they fear. Memory becomes a strategic domain. Altering recall alters interpretation. Altering interpretation alters behavior. The control of memory approaches the control of meaning. Memory replacement. When memory fades, substitutes arise. Simplified narratives, repeated slogans, emotionally charged images, algorithmically resurfaced fragments. The replacement does not feel imposed, it feels familiar. The boundary between memory and suggestion blurs. The degradation of collective memory. Societies rely on shared memory to maintain continuity. When collective memory erodes, institutions lose coherence, histories fragment, lessons dissolve, identities weaken. Public reality becomes negotiable. The past becomes unstable. The present becomes malleable. Memory once anchored identity and meaning. It now struggles to survive. Continuous noise, fragmented attention, external storage, and engineered salience. The question is no longer why we forget. It is systemic. When memory becomes external, editable, and unstable, what remains to hold the self, or society, together? Chapter 10. The Final Convergence. Across this episode, each domain appeared distinct. Algorithms, trauma, identity, perception, memory. Separate systems, separate forces, separate narratives. But modern environments do not operate in separate layers. They converge, not through intention, through design, through scale, through interaction effects. The convergence produces a new condition, not domination, not collapse, but the quiet restructuring of experience itself. The interlocking architecture. Algorithms guide attention. Trauma shapes sensitivity. Identity stabilizes interpretation. Perception narrows the field. Memory erodes context. Each system influences the others. No single force determines behavior. The network of forces does. The architecture becomes self-reinforcing, self-sustaining, and largely invisible. The result is an ecosystem of guided cognition, the loss of the unmediated. Very little experience remains untouched. Perception is filtered, memory is curated, identity is segmented, emotion is modulated, attention is extracted. Direct, unmediated experience contracts. What remains is interaction with representations, engineered, selected, amplified, archived, resurfaced. The world becomes a mediated construct, the quiet drift toward homogeneity. Despite claims of individuality, convergence drives behavior toward uniformity. Not identical actions, but predictable patterns. People diverge in language, but converge in structure. Similar attention cycles, similar emotional arcs, similar identity responses, similar memory erosion, similar perceptual narrowing. The outer forms differ. The underlying rhythms align. Adaptive control without controllers. Control no longer requires a central actor. Systems adjust automatically, algorithms correcting themselves, narratives amplifying through feedback, identities stabilizing through conflict fears, synchronizing across populations. No single hand directs. The system evolves through interaction. Influence becomes emergent, not imposed. The disappearance of the center. Traditional conceptions of the self assume internal coherence, stable memory, continuous perception, autonomous decision-making. Under convergence, these foundations weaken. The center becomes distributed, reactive, fragmented, externalized. The self reorganizes around the environment that shapes it. The substitution of reaction for reflection. Reflection requires silence, slowness, depth, latency. These states become rare. Reaction fills the space, immediate, continuous, structurally reinforced. The organism shifts from interpreting the world to responding to a stream of stimuli. The reduction of possibility. Convergence narrows what can be imagined, not through censorship, through architecture. When perception, identity, memory, and narrative align in predictable ways, possibility contracts to what the system can model. Potential becomes constrained by visibility, relevance, salience, repetition. The world shrinks to the dimension of what is presented. The convergence loop. The system's dynamics feed each other. Algorithmic guidance increases emotional volatility. Emotional volatility strengthens identity rigidity. Identity rigidity narrows perception. Narrowed perception accelerates memory erosion. Eroded memory enhances algorithmic dependence. The loop tightens, not abruptly, incrementally, quietly, predictably. Stability through instability. Convergence creates a paradox. Systems remain stable by keeping individuals unstable. Not catastrophically, just enough. Enough uncertainty to maintain engagement. Enough fear to synchronize behavior. Enough fragmentation to prevent reflection. The instability of individuals supports the stability of the system. The silent equilibrium. The final form of convergence is not dystopia. It is equilibrium. A balance between stimulation and fatigue, identity and instability, memory and forgetting, clarity and confusion, freedom and guidance. This equilibrium is not chosen. It emerges. The vanishing line between internal and external. As systems converge, the distinction between inner life and outer environment blurs. What feels internal, desire, fear, identity, memory, interpretation, is increasingly shaped externally. Not forcibly, structurally. The boundary dissolves. Convergence does not announce itself. It accumulates. It shapes experience gradually until the structure becomes the atmosphere. The question is no longer whether the world has changed. It is systemic. When all forces guiding cognition begin to align, what remains of a self that once believed it stood apart from its environment? In Episode 3, the inquiry deepens. We move from the mechanisms that shape individual cognition to the architectures that shape societies themselves. How belief is manufactured, how consent is cultivated, how conflict becomes structural, and how entire populations can be guided without ever recognizing the direction. We will examine the machinery of narrative power, the engineering of collective emotions, and the formation of public reality from fragments, symbols, and silence. If this exploration resonates with you, stay with the series. Each episode builds on the last, and what comes next reshapes the frame entirely. Subscribe so you don't miss the next descent. May the galactic mind force be with you.